Mabuhay. Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. My name is Christine, and this is episode 9 on the Ozone Disco tragedy. As you may have noticed, Lagim has got some new intro music. Although I loved Lagim's previous intro and will be forever grateful to the wonderful and talented Ginji for allowing me to use her music, I thought it was time to change it up a bit. Hope you like the new one and did not find the change of pace too jarring. Now to our episode. Please be warned that this episode will contain gory details on burn injuries and death, so make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening. Not too long ago, a fire broke out in a tall residential building in London called Grenfell Tower. The circumstances surrounding the fire, the subsequent inquiry that found so many problems about the way the building was constructed, amongst other things, and the poor response by the UK government to the tragedy itself has brought back some memories of witnessing almost in real time the news that covered one of the most tragic fire related crimes in the Philippines, the Ozone Disco fire. I remember I was in Manila a few days after the fire broke out. I remember it was a Sunday, and my mom suggested that we should try getting into this live Sunday noon show called ASAP, that is. The show always needed a live audience to cheer for its hosts and guests, and so my mom thought it would be a good idea to at least see if we could get in. And we did. We watched the show, enjoyed it, and went home, almost on a high, really. It was an experience. My mom and I took a taxi home, and whilst in the taxi, my mom got to talking with the driver, as she always would. Next thing I could remember was my mom asking me, Anak, do you remember the news about the disco that caught fire? Me, the sleepy 11-year-old, nodded. That is the place right there. She pointed to my left side. I opened the taxi cab's windows, much to the driver's dismay, because I really wanted to see what she was trying to tell me. I did remember about the fire. I remembered about the reports, and as I opened the window, I can still remember to this very day how the surroundings smelled like all sorts of burnt debris and maybe something that could have been the remaining smell of burnt human flesh, but I could not be sure at that moment. I remember making the observation that the place seemed so narrow and so small. Years later, I would read up on the story again and the case that later followed it, and somehow my perception of the place being so small made so much more sense the more I learned about its true story. So, what do we know about the events that led to the fire? March marks the end of the school year in the Philippines. Students say goodbye to their classmates and they join their families in preparing for whatever the summer has in store for them. Now, just for context, the months of March, April, and May make up the summer season in the Philippines, so it makes a lot of sense to end the school year by March. During the summer season, Filipino families love to frequent the beaches. The weather is hot and dry, very different from the monsoon months in the second half of the year when it can be humid and rainy. And this brings us to the summer of 1996 in Quezon City. Students who were in their late teens, students who were essentially young adults, found themselves finally freed from their college itineraries and assignments. It was time to party. The Ozone Disco along Timog Avenue in Quezon City was hugely popular in the 90s, especially among students. So it was gearing itself and preparing for the influx of young guests ready to spend money on booze and dance the night away to officially welcome the summer of 1996. Monday rolled in and the party-hungry students started filling up the popular disco. By 8 or 9 p.m., the place was already packed with dancing and drinking guests. It was later estimated that around 350 guests and 40 employees were on the premises at the time, something that would prove as an important piece of information since the club was only meant to host around 100 people, or so we initially thought. So the party was finally getting started, and the bar was serving all sorts of drinks. After all, management had the clever idea to put in place a graduation promo to further entice the guests in buying the now discounted drinks. Now, according to witness and survivor Sherilyn Bruan, the first time people noticed something had gone wrong was when people saw what looked like a spark up on the ceiling above the DJ's booth. The spark was first thought to be some part of special effect, maybe organized by the employees of Ozone. But when the spark developed into flames that started spreading to the rest of the ceiling, it was clear to her and many other guests that this was not a party trick at all. According to Bruan, whilst others have started to reach the first door in an attempt to exit the disco, some were still dancing, not really realizing the gravity of the situation that was developing right above them. The DJ at this point also noticed the fire that was developing on the ceiling and tried to announce to the crowd what was going on, but his mic would not turn on anymore. Eventually, the power went out, and people finally realized the urgency of their situation. A stampede quickly developed. People were desperately trying to get through the two doors within the building. Whilst it was fine to go through the first door, and indeed many made it through it quite easily, the second door was a whole different issue. Reports by survivors would later reveal that the security personnel refused to open the second door, thinking that what they were hearing from inside the disco was the start of perhaps a riot or physical altercation. To add to the difficulties of that situation, as it turned out, the second door only opened inwards. So, when the doors were finally opened by the security personnel, Bruan said it created a strong backdraft that people almost fell down because of it. They were hit by an invisible wave, really. Bruan made it out alive but was badly injured. But the scene was still unfolding behind her when she finally decided to go to the hospital to seek medical attention. Meanwhile, firefighters did their best to stop the fire at Ozone. Their task was complicated when relatives of the guests started arriving, crying and wanting to look for their loved ones. The chaos they caused, albeit understandable, added to the difficult task that the firefighters had to deal in front of them. After 4 hours of fighting the angry fire emanating from Ozone, the firefighters finally noticed how the cries and screaming inside the disco had finally died down. But there was no time to waste. Arson and police investigators and rescue teams were finally able to go through the devastating scene after the last embers had stopped glowing. The rescue teams would later report that the bodies of those who died were piled waist high in the corridor that led to the disco's dance floor. The bodies were so badly burned that some of them had ended up stuck to each other and had to be subsequently detached from each other for identification purposes. An almost impossible task, I can imagine. The Ozone Disco fire claimed around 160 lives that fateful Monday night and injured 100 others more. For a period of time, it would be known as the worst fire tragedy in the Philippines' national capital region, and the seventh worst fire tragedy in the world, later only to be surpassed by a nightclub fire in Buenos Aires, Argentina. As the nation learned more and more about the tragedy and its victims at Ozone, more information would come out that made it clear that this tragedy could probably have been avoided but for the failings of the very people who had a duty of care towards their guests. A lot of these important and also shocking details would come out during the court proceedings that lasted around 13 years. We will come back to these very details that the investigators and eventually the court unearthed at the time. But let's go to the court proceedings for now. Criminal court proceedings were initiated against the operators and shareholders of Ozone almost immediately after the fire. The court considered the actions and omissions of the people in charge when they were running Ozone. By 2001, 5 years after the tragedy that claimed so many lives at Ozone, the court was ready to render its decision. On the 16th of March 2001, Ozone Disco operators Hermilo Ocampo and Ramon Nang were convicted of reckless imprudence that resulted in multiple homicide and multiple serious injuries. They were sentenced to 4 years in prison each and were also fined more than 25 million pesos for their crimes. This fine would essentially come out as an indemnity of around 150,000 pesos for each of the families of the dead victims and another 100,000 pesos for those who have been injured. Not enough, if you ask me. The decision was not welcomed by the relatives of the dead victims as well as the injured survivors. The sentence was deemed as too light, and the decision in general was seen as, well, cheap justice. They have waited 5 years for this decision, and it all seems so anticlimactic, crushingly disappointing when it was finally handed down. But the fight was not over. The operators of the disco may have been sentenced for now, but the government officials who allowed the operators to run the business also needed to be held accountable. So, the proceedings continued and focused on the government officials this time. In November 2001, the anti-graft court called Sandigan Bayan also charged 12 officials of the Quezon City government with reckless imprudence resulting in multiple homicides and multiple physical injuries for alleged involvement in the granting of safety clearance and permits to the operators of Ozone without actually conducting any inspections of the premises and despite known several structural defects. The operators of the disco and the government officials were essentially colluding. But what did we actually find out during these proceedings about what preceded the fire or what caused it? Amongst many other things, the investigators would testify that there were no sprinklers within the Ozone Disco premises. There were no fire exits inside the disco either. And as already mentioned, the only entrance door swung inwards, something the owner said was deliberately made so to follow good feng shui. Just about the oddest justification for a design that proved to be deadly in the end. The judge remarked that even this one door that swung inwards was way too small and did not meet building standards. Additionally, the fire extinguishers that were in place inside the disco turned out to be defective. Furthermore, the supposed alternative exit, which was located in the VIP lounge, was in reality obstructed by a sofa and an LPG or liquefied petroleum gas tank, which only led to a firewall. Also, remember when I remarked earlier on how even as a kid I thought that the disco looked awfully small? Well, the disco was originally only equipped to have 35 people in it. How 350 people were allowed into such an establishment can only be the result of negligence, greed, and an utter lack of regard for life and one's duty of care. It is puzzling, to say the least. The investigators and medical examiners would also later say of the dead victims that most of them probably had died because of the stampede more than the fire itself. They were apparently crushed to death way before they were enveloped by the smoke and fire within the premises. Ozone Disco was essentially a fire trap. The court would say in its decision, specifically of the government officials, and I quote, the slapdash approval of the building permits and certificate of occupancy, marked by a lackadaisical screening of the paper requirements, marks the building's officials' evident bad faith and manifest partiality to favor applicant regardless of consequences. End of quote. The court continued to comment as to the ozone operators, and I quote, the audacity of Westwood Entertainment Co. Incorporated in the construction of Ozone Dance Club by evading compliance with the National Building Code to suit its own business purpose is simply overwhelming. End of quote. Please note that Westwood Entertainment was the company that actually owned Ozone Disco, and yes, its official name was Ozone Dance Club. Finally, the court also found, and this was no surprise to anyone at all, that the collusion between the Quezon City government officials and Ozone's operators essentially aggravated the death toll. As I already mentioned earlier, the proceedings took ages. By August 23, 2007, one of the 12 government officials was acquitted. By November 20th, 2014, 7 former Quezon City officials were convicted of graft and corruption in connection with the ozone tragedy. They were all sentenced to 6 to 10 years in jail, same as the operators of ozone. All in all, 9 out of the 14 people charged in this case were sentenced. What was probably less known in all these years of covering the slow and long process of attaining justice for the victims and survivors were Westwood Entertainment's stockholders and how they factor in when it came to accountability. In reality, Nang and Ocampo were 2 of, I believe, 6 stockholders and directors in the company. I could not find definitive information about this. But, as it turns out, the other 4 were also charged and then eventually acquitted due to the prosecution's failure to present sufficient evidence to convict them. Nang and Ocampo were deemed to be in a very different position as the others due to their more hands-on involvement in obtaining the necessary permits and in operating the establishment itself. The others were considered to have had a more passive role, not really knowing what was going on the ground. On the whole, we have seen yet again how the Filipino justice system has a way of prolonging cases, much to the stress, pressure, and general detriment of everyone involved. And yet, as already hinted earlier, even after a 13-year court case about a, now 25-year-old tragedy, the relatives of the dead and the survivors still did not feel like there was any real justice. Some of the survivors did not get to see and hear the verdict as they had already died before 2014, which, adds to this story an extra layer of sadness and tragedy. In the end, one thing still remains a mystery. What had actually started the fire? There was no official finding as to the starting point and cause of the fire, but some reports said that it may have been triggered by a cooking fuel tank that exploded within the kitchen. But even now, one cannot be sure. So, what happened to the building that once housed the Ozone Disco? The building remained in its place in Quezon City until 2015. It was then demolished a week before the tragedy's 19th anniversary. In its place now is a branch of a food chain owned by known Filipino talk show host Boy Abunda. 25 years on, what were the lessons learned? I think it's easy to summarize the lessons learned as do not do what the government officials and the ozone operators did. The mistakes made were obvious and easily avoidable. And you would think that after the Ozone Disco tragedy, things may have shifted and improved for the better, but I'm afraid that things largely remain the same. Fire safety standards remain poor, and fires break out quite easily and quite often, especially in dense areas such as the slums. Government officials still remain susceptible to corruption when it comes to strictly implementing building codes and fire safety inspections. A tragedy like ozone may not have happened on a similar scale again these past 25 years, but this does not mean that fires have stopped devastating properties, lives, and livelihood. As long as safety standards are not strictly upheld, and as long as government officials are willing to be bribed and bought by business people, it will not be long from now until we hear about another tragedy that may have been easily prevented and avoided. And on that somber and hopefully thought-provoking note, I would like to end this episode and thank you again for listening. Just a few thoughts before I truly end this episode. When I was planning to cover the Ozone Disco tragedy, my goal or my dream was to be able to interview one of these survivors. And when I read about Sherilyn Bruan, the survivor that I mentioned earlier in this story, I immediately looked for her on Instagram and on Facebook. I did find her on Instagram and I messaged her, but I don't think she has read my message yet. So, if at some point she does respond to me, I'll make sure that I talk to her about maybe doing an interview and maybe we can produce an interview episode together. So, make sure that you are updated about everything that has to do with Lagim, and you can do so by following us on our Instagram. Our handle on Instagram is at Lagim Podcast. Lagim is also on other social media platforms. We are on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook. We have a page and also a discussion group, so make sure to look for Lagim Podcast and Lagim Podcast discussion group to join a community of like-minded true crime lovers. We are also on YouTube, so if you are not a podcasting platform fan just yet, make sure to stream all of our past episodes and this one on YouTube. So just type in Lagim Podcast on YouTube. If you want to support this podcast of mine, you can become a patron on Patreon by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com and look for Lagim Podcast. At the moment, you can subscribe to only one tier where you will be able to get early access to the episodes that I release every 2 weeks and also future bonus episodes. And lastly, please do not forget to rate Lagim on Apple Podcasts. Make sure to leave Lagim a 5-star rating and a nice little comment. This will greatly help other people discover and listen to Lagim. Before I go, I would like to add a new segment to each of the episodes that I will be doing from this moment onwards. I would like to do a podcast recommendation of the week. And these are podcasts that I usually listen to and enjoy myself. This week's recommendation is Ivy League Murders Podcast. This podcast is hosted by Laura and Sarah, and both of them discuss the most haunting cases to spin out of some of America's most elite educational institutions. Here's their trailer.
Welcome to Ivy League Murders. The Ivy League. They are the 8 most prestigious colleges in the nation. And as we've seen recently, people will do or pay anything to get their kids into them. When you hear Ivy League, what comes to mind? Is it the hallowed halls of education and tradition, professors in tweed coats pontificating about Walt Whitman, elitism, finals clubs? What you probably don't think of is murder. On this podcast, we focus on cases affiliated with the Ivy League, exploring the darker side of higher education. What happens when genius becomes evil? We deep dive into the stories behind the picture-perfect Ivy Leaguers who appear to have everything and throw it all away. And for what? Love? Money? Obsession? My name is Sarah Alcorn. I'm a Harvard graduate, and I've been a private investigator since 1999. Join me and longtime crime diva Laura McDonald for Ivy League Murders.
Again, thank you very much for listening to this episode, and come back in 2 weeks for another story here at Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Maraming salamat.